Hey there, welcome to YouTube. If you are into poetry, if you are into literature, if you are into cultural history, then you've come to the right place. Cardboard Box Productions makes podcasts about all those things, so be sure to click the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so that you never miss a new episode. Obviously, we mostly make podcasts, so you can also go to anywhere you get your podcasts, if it's a place other than YouTube, like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and you can subscribe to our podcast feeds there. All right, I hope you enjoy this episode. Hello and welcome to Close Talking, the world's most popular poetry analysis podcast from Cardboard Box Productions Incorporated. I am co-host Jack Rossiter Munley, and with my good friend Connor McNamara Stratton, we read a poem,
talk about the poem,
and read the poem again.
Before we get into today's selection, a quick note that if you like what we do here at Close Talking and have a spare minute of your time, it would mean the world to us if you would give the podcast a rating and review on Apple Podcasts.
Those ratings and reviews help boost us up the algorithm and find new listeners.
And if you have suggestions for future episodes or comments on this one, you can send us an email at closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com.
And you can also find us on social media. On Twitter, the show is @CloseTalking. I am @Jack Rossiter Munn, and Connor is @Connor M. Stratton. On Instagram, the show is @CloseTalkingPoetry, and on Facebook, it's facebook.com/CloseTalking. We also have a website, closetalking.com, where you can find all the past episodes of the show, and Cardboard Box Productions has just launched a newsletter, Unboxed, and if you go to cardboardboxproductionsinc.com, you can subscribe for more behind-the-scenes stuff on Close Talking and all of the other literary and cultural history podcasts that Cardboard Box Productions makes. On with the show.
Welcome, everyone, to a new episode of Close Talking. Oh my God, I am Connor McNamara Stratton.
And I am Jack Rossiter Munley.
And this is Close Talking.
Close Talking.
Okay, we have a wonderful poem today. Poem is A Woman Without a Country by Eavan Boland. And just a little context about Eavan Boland before I read the poem. She was born in Dublin, Ireland in 1944. And she's considered one of the great Irish poets alive today. There's a sort of rudimentary Irish, quote-unquote Irish canon that's very male-centric. That starts with Yeats, then goes to Patrick Kavanagh, and then goes to Seamus Heaney. She has lived longer than Seamus Heaney and is killing it, and has written a lot about the patriarchal Irish literary landscape, and has dedicated a lot of her writing to writing against that. And this poem is a great example of that. It was originally published in Poetry Magazine in 2013, I think the April issue.
And it's the title poem of her 2014 book.
So it is, which I need to get. Usually I recommend the book, but I haven't read the book. I read it in poetry when I had a subscription, which I should get again, but
it's tough to keep up with everything.
It's tough. They just keep
I think
coming.
You can be forgiven.
All right. Appreciate it. Thanks, Jack. A Woman Without a Country. As dawn breaks, he enters a room with the odor of acid. He lays the copper plate on the table and reaches for the shaft of the burin. Dublin wakes to horses and rain. Street hawkers call. All the news is famine and famine. The flat graver, the round graver, the angle tint tool wait for him. He bends to his work and begins. He starts with the head, cutting in to the line of the cheek, finding the slope of the skull. incising the shape of a face that becomes a foundry of shadows, rendering, with a deeper cut into copper, the whole woman as a skeleton. The rags of her skirt, her wrist in a bony line forever severing, her body from its native air until she is ready for the page, for the street vendor, for a new inventory, which now to loss and to laissez-faire adds the odor of acid and the little pitiless tragedy of being imagined. He puts his tools away one by one, lays them out carefully on the deal table, his work done.
Great pick.
I love this poem.
Yeah, I really enjoy. I was not familiar with this poem. The poem I most knew her for was, the title escapes me, but it's about the two people who die of cold during the famine.
Oh, I don't know if I know that one.
I think it's called Quarantine.
Okay. Quarantine.
And it's about these people. I believe it's based on a real thing that happened, where this guy died with his wife out in the cold because they were trying to make their way like from their cabin to town or something. And he had put her feet against his body to try and keep them warm, and they died like that.
Oh my God. That's terrifying.
I mentioned that because the way that this poem is written is much more, for lack of a better term, poetic than that work, and the work that I mostly know from her.
Yeah, that's interesting. That would be interesting to look at. She was born in 1944. I think her first book of poems came out in 1962. So this is 2013 coming out. So like 6 decades of published writing. So she's had some time to hone her craft. So starting sort of broadly about what the poem is about, the action of the poem is basically some nameless man enters, seems like his metalworking studio or area, or a foundry of some kind, cuts out like a metal contour of a woman and then finishes it. That's basically, I think, the basic plot.
Oh, I think we're also meant to understand that it's an engraving plate to be used for a newspaper.
Ooh, that's key. Okay, so thank you, Jack. So this is probably not a foundry. This is probably the newspaper office or something. Or I don't know.
Or it's his room. It's sort of unclear where it happens. There's no strong sense of place in it. And even the idea of it being for a newspaper, I think, is at best hinted at. I do think that's what's going on. But
yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Because at the beginning, you're told what's going on in the news, and the street hawkers are calling, and you're out in the street. Then he's in this room making all of this. And then at the end, a new inventory goes out to the street vendors with, I think we're meant to understand this, images on it.
That is a good reading. And that there was a question that I had about like what exactly this is going for. But I think that's probably right. But yeah, and then moving into the sort of broader, I guess the way that I start thinking about this poem is there's, I think, like a sort of specific larger meaning to Ireland and Ireland history, and then sort of a broader meaning that can be extended about like women and the patriarchy generally. And so specifically, I actually read this poem as happening in the Great Famine, or around then in 1847. We have Dublin wakes to horses and rain. So we have horses, that's a sense of when it is, and then all the news is famine and famine, which seems to be very sort of direct. And then also the laissez-faire, I've done a little bit of research, but one common attribution or like cause of the famine was the British laissez-faire policy that they had at the time. So I think that is sort of a reference to that. And then more broadly, there's a long history in Ireland of sort of like nationalist poems, literature, writing, speeches, ideas that use the woman or an idea of the woman as the call to like nationalist action. One example of this is, I think it's pronounced the Eisling or the Aisling, which was a sort of oral poem, like vision poem in the 16 and 1700s, where this guy would receive this sort of vision of this goddess woman who was like known as a Sparevan or something. And she would like seduce him into inspiration to like fight for Ireland before, and get independence. That's like one beginning that, even poets like Yeats, who never wrote like Aislings, would still sort of draw on to some extent. And that carries on, I think, through. So I think the image of the little pitiless tragedy of being imagined, which I think is like a great line, has to do with the use of women in Irish literature and writing and politics as a prop or an object for their nationalist sort of cause.
It's really interesting. And I know that Boland herself, I saw a talk that she gave, and she talked about what it was like growing up in what she described as a small country with intense history. And then talked about how her own understanding of that came from thinking of history and the past as two distinct ideas, and that history is this received official version that contains heroic figures and to some extent a lack of nuance, and that the past is where you meet real people and you find the shadows and the shade. Her poetry, I think a lot of it is grounded in telling historical stories, and in doing so through bringing you people level accounts. The other poem I mentioned, Quarantine, is about two people. It's not about the major socio-political forces. It's not about some heroic figure. It's not about divine inspiration. It's about this human moment between two people at the end of their lives. This poem, similarly, is essentially one guy's day at work. It's a lot more complicated than that, but basically this guy goes to work, does his job, and then leaves.
Yeah, it reminds me of actually the Yusuf Komunyakaa urban renewal in the way that the title works too. So the title of this, A Woman Without a Country, very big thematic stuff. And similarly, urban renewal has sort of larger, political implications. And then the content of the poem, with some very important exceptions, are largely just a sort of physical description of someone doing, as you say, their day job, basically. Whereas urban renewal sort of focuses on the physical sort of demolition of a building.
True. And if you want to hear us talk about urban renewal, check out the second episode of Close Talking, where we talk about Yusuf Komunyakaa's urban renewal.
We do it.
I'm very interested in the title because in going through the poem the first time, as opposed to making it easier for me to understand it, I think it was challenging me because I could see where the woman comes in, obviously, but I could not initially see where the without a country comes from. And I have a couple ideas about that, but I'm interested on what your thoughts are about a woman without a country.
Yeah. So, and just before I specifically get into that, there was the Ireland specific meaning that I talked about, and then broadly, which I think will just permeate our discussion. But I think there's a very women being used for men's ends, and like the projection of an idea of a woman has, I think, very broad universal applicability. I think about all these movies and TV plot lines where the man becomes, that the man is redeemed because he gets the lady at the end. And similarly, like the whole, this is another smaller example, but the implications of like catcalling is based around the idea that a woman exists for the men just to be looked at, and she's in their space to be commented on. And the result of that, because it's an imagining, is we have all these, like, we talk about the unrealistic expectations or demands put on women, like to look a certain way, etc. And those sort of things are working hand in hand that I think this poem speaks to, although it is focusing a little more specifically on Ireland.
I'm interested in the idea of imagining because essentially this woman is only ever imagined. Like, this is not a real woman. This is not a real person. She's brought into being by this male artist. We get two people who we actually spend time with, people in air quotes that you can't see because this is audio, but I'm air quoting. We get a he and a she. The he is the artist, and the she is this sort of creation of his, this piece that he engraves. First, she's his idea of whatever he's trying to convey. And then once she's out in the world, we're told that she falls into the pitiless tragedy of being imagined. Now it's everyone else writing onto this image of her, whatever they want. She herself, as an image, is never given her own agency, is never given her own place or central existence or idea. She's just hungry woman number 4. Think of her what you will.
Right. Yeah, so that's very interesting. Yeah, so getting to the title you've asked about, where I start to make sense of it is in the lines, I guess starting, the whole woman as a skeleton, the rags of her skirt, her wrist in a bony line forever severing her body from its native air until she is ready for the page. So one also formal note that we can talk about later is this is a very interesting part where the whole poem is basically one stanza of lines that are all pretty similar length. So like the first 2 lines are, as dawn breaks, he enters, line break, a room with the odor of acid. And then the poem just continues downward. Severing, the word, is broken off and has its sort of own line below in a bony line forever. And then it's like line break, and then severing is indented. So it sort of like hovers to the lower right of forever. So I want to say that because it's not, when you hear it, you can't actually see that effect. But the line, severing her body from its native air, seems to be the closest image to a woman without a country. So native air has that country aesthetic. And I guess the way that I think about it is when this woman and women are used in this way, they become useful if it's like a national propaganda type thing, or even just some sort of used politically. They are useful in that context, but then are not able to actually have either like an agency, political agency in the making of some country, or just like are not free to be the strange human people that every human is. And so in that way, they lose their country because they lose their ability to move freely about that native air, because they're just being fixed into the image of the political situation. That's sort of what I'm thinking, but I don't know if that's fleshed out very well.
I like that a lot. That whole little section was really interesting to me, and particularly the fact that severing as a line literally severs the poem into 2 parts. I really liked that as a line break and as a stylistic choice, because it would be easy to put that word on its own, but to take it and to put it essentially right justified as opposed to left justified, so that it's at the edge of all of the text way over there, it creates that blank space separating the poem, which I think is pretty cool. And when I was thinking about that line in particular and the severing, the image I had was of an engraver literally scraping her form out of the native air of the blank piece of copper. And it made me think of the Michelangelo quote about essentially like the form is within the block of marble and the artist sees it and carves it out, which I actually went and got because I think it's interesting, because it sort of covers, I think, a lot of the artistic journey that we see in the creation of this image. And the quote is fairly short. "In every block of marble, I see a statue as plain as though it stood before me, shaped and perfect in attitude and action. I have only to hew away the rough walls that imprison the lovely apparition to reveal it to the other eyes as mine see it."
Ooh, that's nice.
And so again, when there's the blank piece of copper, you could create any image or story, any type of woman. When you're writing a poem, as Eavan Boland is, or as another writer in the Irish tradition, there's any woman you can create artistically with your craft. But if when you look at that copper, or if when you look at that marble, you have a particular vision and you know what you intend to wring out of that raw material, and what you bring out is to show others the way you see it. If you're a man engraver and you want to draw famine woman or whatever, I mean, that's essentially what I take from it. It could be different, but I think that's what we're led to believe it is.
The whole woman as a skeleton, the rags of her skirt.
And if that's what you're seeing, and you're carving it out as sort of a representation, this is a woman without a nation. She doesn't have anything of her own. She's your vision that you've carved out of the copper. And then, as the end of the Michelangelo quote says, "An apparition to reveal it to the other eyes as mine see it," everyone else also just imagines things onto her. The other eyes see it the same way.
Yeah, no, that I agree completely. It's interesting too, I feel like there's a lot of things that can be read in a few different ways. And the one way that I just really love that part, the whole woman as a skeleton, the rags of her skirt, her wrist in a bony line forever severing. Because skeleton and rags of her skirt gets at the sort of visual image of, an actual famished woman, but also gets at the symbolic. So, a woman without a country, also a woman without flesh, just a bony, wrist and skeleton. So that is in some way also what's being removed. And then I like to, I'm glad you brought up the line break of severing. The other thing that it also does is draw attention, not just to severing, which it certainly does, and that sort of miming effect that the line break has of sort of replicating the severing is what you're talking about. It also draws attention to the word forever. So there's in a bony line, forever line break, severing her body from its native air. So we get the sense of this poem reaching out from the time of which it's sort of recording and saying this is a forever process. This is happening. This has been happening. And this effect is not just isolated to the day in the life of this engraver man, or in Ireland in the 19th century, or Ireland specifically, but has this larger reach.
Definitely. No, and the specificity in that section of the poem as well.
Yeah.
Where sort of the implications are the largest, but the language becomes the most specific and the most intense in many ways.
Yeah.
Like, this is the most descriptive section that we get in the poem. And it is where those larger sort of themes and implications are really at play. And the language choice is fascinating to me. And the way that the act is described, there's cutting, incision, severing, skeleton, skull, bony. There's a lot of S sounds for one, but it also is like kind of medical and surgical, which I thought was really interesting. And like all of this, the way that the two lines fall, he starts with the head cutting in, is a line on its own. And then you get to the line of the cheek, finding the slope of the skull, incising. And again, the line stops at incising, finding the slope of the skull and incising. It sounds like he's cutting her head open.
Yeah.
In both of those instances, at first it sounds like he's just drawing a knife across her face. And then in the next one, it sounds like he's going to cut her head open. Like, it's really, the first time reading through, I was like, where is this going? Because number one, unless you know what a burin is, or like, what are the other ones? A round graver and a flat graver and an angle tint tool. Unless you happen to be familiar with the engraving arts, which maybe you are. You might be a more worldly person than myself. I had to look that up.
Yeah, me too.
And I was like, oh, so this dude's like an engraver. At first, I'm like, what is going on here with this bro? Like, what's his deal? I sort of assumed he wasn't. I mean, it's pretty clear that he's, not cutting people open is what I'm going for here. Like, he's not a surgeon. He's not cutting people open. It was pretty clear he's an artist of some kind, but not knowing necessarily what the exact tools are, it's hard to form an image, and the way the language comes together in that area is really giving you this sort of medical feel, particularly the time period that it's being written in, the sort of patriarchal role of medicine and surgery. And
yeah, I'm glad you brought that section up. I totally, I like looked up what a graver was, and I was like, oh, it's an engraver. Great. Okay. I'm figuring it out.
That was my guess with those ones, but I was like, what is a burin?
Yeah, what is a burin? How do you say it? Is it a burin? Is it a burin? Is it a burin?
You said burin, and you're super Irish, so I figured that you knew.
I also looked that up, and I pressed my little pronounce thing on dictionary.com app, and it was like burin. So then I did burin.
Cool.
But it also looked like you could also say burin. So we leave it up to that. But I like that you bring up these line breaks. He starts with the head, cutting in, line break to the line of the cheek, finding. One small note about the pacing. These enjambments come very deliberately. So before that, except for the first line, every line ends with either a full stop period or like a comma. So the first line, as dawn breaks, he enters enjambment, a room with the odor of acid, but then full stop. And then things really slow down. Every line is its own discrete thought. And it's really like intensely intentional. He lays the copper plate on the table, period, and reaches for the shaft of the burin, period. That could easily be one sentence. There's no reason, like he lays the copper plate on the table and reaches for the shaft of the burin. You could easily do that in one sentence. But Boland is like very discreetly slowing things down. Then, getting the stuff together, Dublin, horses rain, getting the tools, famine. Then he bends to his work and begins, full stop. And then as soon as he begins his work, the enjambments begin. So then the next line, he starts with the head, cutting in to the line of the cheek, finding the slope of the skull, incising the shape of a face that becomes a foundry of shadows. And then things finally slow down. But there's...
but even then, that sentence doesn't end until the pitiless tragedy of being imagined.
Yep.
That sentence, with punctuation sprinkled in, is like the whole, it's half the poem.
Yeah, so that's...
And on both sides of it, you get really short sentences, but that one really stands out.
So after he bends to his work and begins, the sentence is 16 lines long. I just counted with my finger. Or maybe 17 if you count severing in its own line. And before that, basically everything has been a one line sentence, and things get short after that. So
to be clear, counting severing, that's 17 lines in a 30-line poem.
Yeah, that's a long ass sentence. And many of those are enjambed. The other thing too that I really like, sonically, it's so tight and intentional is there's a lot of N, M, and like IN sounds at the ends of the lines. So we have burin, rain, famine, him, begins, cutting in, finding, incising, rendering, skeleton. Those are in the first sort of half, those are ends of all lines. And then there's a pause, and this is, I think, is interesting, and especially when the enjambments start, so he bends to his work and begins, the first four are begins, cutting in, finding, incising. So those are really emphasize those sounds. Then, and this I think is intentional because this is when if you remember, this is the lines, these are some of the lines that we were focusing on, which Boland is drawing attention to. A foundry of shadows, rendering with a deeper cut into copper, the whole woman as a skeleton, the rags of her skirt, her wrist into bony line forever. That's sort of the enjambment stop, and then we focus on that, and then there are no, in that kind of thing, no INs at the ends of lines, and then her wrist in a bony line forever, severing. And severing is the next instance of that kind of IN or ING sound. So and also has it with that connotation of cutting in and incising with the sort of removing action. So I think Boland is setting up our ear to hear these sort of like IN sounds, and then is like changing the structure so that we focus on that whole woman as a skeleton image, which is like very central. And then when she returns for like her killer verb, severing, she puts it on her own line. It's like hovering weirdly, and we remember the echoes of all of the IN words before that, cutting in, finding, incising, etc.
Definitely. I think severing is also to some extent set up by the number of S sounds that pervade in there, because in those, particularly the two lines, the slope of the skull incising the shape of a face, the sound in there is just over and over and over and over again. And then you get the rags of her skirt, her wrist, as a little callback to that right before you hit severing, which is the IN and the S sound in one word, all on its own. It's come to this. There is no other option, no way out.
And forever severing is a perfect couple with the ER sounds. It's like so tight, forever severing. So, I mean, it's a sonic gold nugget right there.
Right there, and she's framed it for you on its own line. She is good, and no big deal. It's also a perfect encapsulation in two words of what an engraver does for a living. They are forever severing. They are always taking small slivers of metal out to create an image. And in this work, that's the severing. He's severing her body from its native air, cutting it out.
Yeah.
Bonkers how good that is.
I know. I mean, that is, how many different elements are working together? We've got the visual image working together. We've got the rhyming working together. We've got the rhythm working together. We've got the lineation working together, the lines and the line lengths. We've got the symbol. I mean,
that's like 5 different things.
That's literally all a poem are those 5 things. So
I think this is the definition of next level shit right here.
It is so next level. I have one other larger point that I think is really cool about this poem. So the poem is drawing attention to the way this particular woman, but women in general, as we've said, are often used, objectified, severed out to be props or objects for some cause or some desire that men want. This poem subtly, it draws attention to that, so that's its first job. But the other thing that it does is, I think, carve out a space where it's severing the sort of man who does this work into the history. So we have just this key guy who's doing nothing. He's doing a lot, but you only see what he does physically. There's no interiority to this guy. He doesn't have a name. He doesn't really know anyone. He's just a worker. And so in this way, he has been stripped of a lot of his humanness, in a way perhaps similarly that women are in the kinds of things that Boland is calling out. So I think by this poem is in its rewriting of political history and Irish history and history generally, it's placing a carve out of a man who's writing the carve out of women. So I think that's one of the functions that it has.
What's really interesting about that too is that this man will be forgotten and that engraving will live on.
Yeah.
Just in terms of what's going on in the history, and for her own distinction of the difference between history and the past, this woman is history. Problematic, not encompassing, and in fact detrimental to women, but she's history, and this man is what Boland discusses as the past. He's the everyday person who would create this kind of an image, perpetuate this notion of a mythic female or a woman upon whom the desires of others could be written, but he himself plays no part in that history. He's relegated to the past. I'm curious, so at the beginning I mentioned that I think this might be an engraving for a newspaper.
Yeah.
Engravings themselves were also sold. Do we think it might just be that she's an engraving that gets made to be sold to an individual? I was sort of unsure because it specifically says that she moves on to the pitiless tragedy of being imagined. Perhaps in my own desire for grandiosity, I'm imagining thousands of people looking at newspapers with her image in it that he created to represent some story about the famine, and they're all looking at it and making up ideas about her, and it's this widely disseminated imagining that's in many ways more harmful. But I think it's also possible that he's just making this as something that goes out to a street vendor, they sell it, he gets the money, the vendor gets the money, and everybody moves on. He makes another one tomorrow.
That's interesting. Both seem possible. The way that the hawkers and the vendors, and the fact that she's ready for the page, that's a good question. I lean towards the newspaper reading.
I do too.
Yeah. I think it's up in the air. To me, though, the way that the up in the air part works, the ambiguity works, is she's ready for the page can be read more easily as like the page as in writing, literature, the canon, those things generally. She's ready to be sold for the street vendor. Right. So to me, that's where I depart from in terms of the ambiguity of the phrase.
I like it. The last thing I want to note quickly, it's just something I liked in the poem, is that she uses the more historical term deal table to basically mean like a plain work table, which I really enjoy coming so quickly after laissez-faire and this picture going out to a vendor to get sold. Because even though it's describing the table, it's another deal as associated with like a money deal. It's just another nice resonance that she happens to get out of it, because she could have said a plain pine table or something, and like, oh, you get a nice little alliteration, like whatever. But the deal table grounds it in the history, and it also is just a nice resonant word to have in that place. And I think that was really well crafted as an unnecessarily good little chunk of poetic decision making.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I like that you brought that up. The last thing, too, that I'll bring up about the last two lines that I love is there's a sort of hidden rhyme. I think that myself included, I'm always tempted to have rhyming couplet at the end, because it's that cathartic, satisfying, we're done, we got the perfect shit going down. But it's very obvious, hard to do, etc. But you still want it. So Boland goes, he puts his tools away, line break, one by one. lays them out carefully on the deal table, his work done. So one by one rhymes with his work done, but one by one is sort of hidden in the middle of the second to last line, and done finishes the last line. So I think that's nice little trick.
It's good.
It's good.
Also, depending on how you pronounce words, you have the away and carefully beforehand. So
that's true. That could be Boland's Irish accent, carefully.
Somehow I don't think so, but
yeah, probably not.
It's all going down. Yeah, that's a really interesting point, and I like that. That's real good.
Oh God, I think we have to read it.
Yeah, let's read it again.
All right. A woman without a country. As dawn breaks, he enters a room with the odor of acid. He lays the copper plate on the table and reaches for the shaft of the burin. Dublin wakes to horses and rain. Street hawkers call. All the news is famine and famine. The flat graver, the round graver, the angle tint tool wait for him. He bends to his work and begins. He starts with the head, cutting in to the line of the cheek, finding the slope of the skull, incising the shape of a face that becomes a foundry of shadows, rendering, with a deeper cut into copper, the whole woman as a skeleton, the rags of her skirt, her wrist in a bony line forever severing her body from its native air until she is ready for the page, for the street vendor, for a new inventory, which now to loss and to laissez-faire adds the odor of acid and the little pitiless tragedy of being imagined. He puts his tools away one by one, lays them out carefully on the deal table, his work done.
Good stuff.
This is co-host Jack Rossiter Munley. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, head on over to Apple Podcasts, leave a review. 5 stars maybe? Those reviews help with the algorithm and are a great way for us to find new listeners. And you can put anything in them. You can write whatever you want. You can just say, oh, this is a good podcast. I like this podcast. You could be like, hey, that Connor guy, he makes a lot of good points. Jack, why is he doing this outro so long? You know, get him off the mic. And whatever you feel like writing, head on over there, 5 stars, drop in the review. Do you have thoughts about this poem? Is there a poem or poet you'd like us to cover on a future episode? Well, we'd love to hear from you. And there are tons of ways that you can get in touch with us. I mean, I guess you could drop it into an iTunes review. You could be like 5 stars. Hey, why don't you talk about insert name of poet here? But you can also send us an email. That's probably the best way to do it. closetalkingpoetry@gmail.com is our email address. Or you can find us on Twitter. I am at Jack Rossiter Munn. Connor is at Connor M. Stratton. And the show is at Close Talking. On Instagram, you can find us there too. We are at Close Talking Poetry, and we are on Facebook at facebook.com/Close Talking. We haven't gotten to TikTok yet, and we might never. Who knows? Anything is possible. Speaking of all those social media platforms, a very special thank you to our incredible social media manager, Corey Chena, who keeps us active across the internet. And a thank you to all of you for listening. We will see you next time.